sire. Good heavens, Miss Sakamoto, you're beautiful.
Hello, North from North Sounds here. Today I'm going to show you how to add samples to your existing KSC file. I'm currently working on the 80s Booster Pack version 3. This sound pack makes use of samples from the Oberheim OBX8 and the Prophet 5 synths. So I sampled my synth and created WAV files and loaded it into sampling mode. After that, I saved my sampling data, which gave me a folder, a KSC file, and a user bank KSC. Now, I want to add more samples to it because it is a work in progress. So I'm going to show you that entire process. So let me just go through some of the sounds that I've been working on. So I've got 1984 and I've got the Oberheim there. So that's two Oberheim multi-samples in there. I've got True, and this one makes use of the Prophet 5. This one Subdivisions. Got Betty Davis Eyes. Betty Davis Eyes makes use of the Prophet 5 samples. Let's Go is also Prophet 5. Also Prophet 5 and Oberheim. And some internal samples. Okay, so I've got that. That's a work in progress. But now I want to create She Blinded Me with Science. And if you're familiar with the song, this makes use of very specific vocal samples. If you don't have those samples playing when you're performing, it's not the song. You just have to have those samples. And I'm in the process of adding them to the library. First thing you have to do to add your samples to your existing KSC is to load your KSC file. So I'm going to go to disk mode. And I've got the 80s Booster version 3. And I always put a WIP while I'm working on a library to see that it's a work in progress. So it's not final yet. It'll be edited, it'll be tweaked, and I have that in a file. So when I open that, I have my PCG files, which contain my programs, my combis, my wave sequences, and all the other data that's not related to the samples. Now, all my sample data is located here. So I've got Booster V3, and that's a folder, and that contains the individual samples. Okay, so normally I don't touch that. And then I've got the KSC file. So the KSC file is what you load into sampling mode, whether you want to play the sounds while the samples are in sampling mode, or if you want to be editing those samples. Now, the user bank KSC is a sort of a later addition to the Korg workflow, wherein your Kronos or your Nautilus could read your samples direct into the hard drive. If you want to save your RAM space, you load your user bank KSC, and usually that's done in the autoload section. Now, since we're in the process of adding more samples to existing sample data, it's this file that has to be loaded. So Booster V3 KSC file. All right. So when I load that, it's going to prompt me to append my samples in sampling mode, meaning it'll add more samples to sampling mode. Right now, there's nothing in sampling mode. I don't want to append anything. You're also given the option to clear sampling mode data or to clear all. Now, when I clear all, that's going to wipe all the samples that are loaded currently in the Kronos. I want to clear all the samples so there's nothing in sampling mode and nothing else is linked with the sample data when I decide to save it later. Okay, so the thing to do if you're editing a set of samples, you go for the clear all option. All right, I'm going to clear it. All my pianos, my strings, and all those samples, the internal samples of the Kronos will be cleared. So there's no possibility of that being resaved into a new file. Okay, so clear all is what I want to do, and that's clearing my sample data. Now, say if I want to look at my piano, my Italian piano, you can see samples not loaded because it's unloaded those other libraries. Okay. So if I go to sampling mode, it'll show me all the sampling data that's been entered in that KSC, that's been saved in that KSC. So this is my Booster Pack V3, and you can see that I have these multi-samples. So these are multi-samples. They already have individual samples mapped out in them. Okay, and they come in pairs of 2 because these are stereo multi-samples. And you always have the option of creating a stereo or a mono multi-sample when you start working on a new one. Okay, so I'm going to add my She Blinded Me with Science samples into my sampling mode. But before I do that, I want to have my new multi-sample ready to accept those samples. So I can see from here that this KSC file that's been loaded in sampling mode has multi-samples from slot 000 to slot 0021. So my next slot for my multi-samples will be in slot 22. So when I select that, it gives me the option to create a new multi-sample in slot 0022, and I can make this into a stereo multi-sample. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to press that, stereo multi-sample, and when I go OK, there you go. I've got a multi-sample ready to go, and it's called New MS, and it's in slot 022. From the get-go, I want to rename this multi-sample into She Blinded Me with Science, because that's what I'm going to be putting in my multi-sample. All right, so there you go, 0022 new multi-sample. I'll go OK, and I've got a blank multi-sample in my sampling mode. Now what I'm going to do is first I'm going to rename that from New MS to She Blinded Me with Science. I'm going to rename multi-sample, and I'll call it She Blinded Me with Science, and maybe a TD for Thomas Dolby. All right, She Blinded Me with Science TD. Right, there you go. So that's what this multi-sample will be called when I save my sampling data later on. You can see that there is a sample slot, and when I touch the arrow over here, it gives me all the samples that have been loaded in sampling mode, including the samples from the previous multi-samples. So the term multi-samples refers to the fact that there are several samples mapped out on your keyboard. So in this case, we have the samples from the previous sampling sessions, and they're already here, and it's a lot of individual samples. Now, those samples from the Prophet and the Oberheim are instrument samples, so they're actually chromatically arranged on the keyboard. Right? You can see that my samples have note values, and those note values named here correspond to the actual keys that those samples have been assigned to. Since I haven't loaded my raw samples yet, there's nothing to be found beyond my Oberheim and my Prophet samples, and that's what I'm about to do. Okay, so when I go to disk mode, I've connected my USB stick that contains the individual wave files for Blinded Me with Science. So I put that into a USB stick. Normally we transfer any wave data into the hard drive for the Khronos to be able to play them back. But in this case, we're actually loading wave files into sampling mode. So the Khronos will actually process those wave files and convert that into its proprietary format, which is your KSF, your Korg sample file. So my She Blinded Me with Science samples are here in my USB stick, right? And I have it in a folder called She Blinded Me with Science. I'll open that. And here are the individual samples, and we can actually listen to these. This is in a wave format, and I've already pre-cut these. I had a stem of She Blinded Me with Science. I went to just GarageBand, not even Logic, and cut those up and saved them individually as wave files. So, all right, so these are the individual samples.
Me.
And
Good heavens! Science! Science! She blinded me!
All right, so those are the samples. I actually have this cuckoo sample, but I'm not a fan of using samples that are melodic phrases or chords. if it's a sound that you can program on the keyboard, I would much rather play it live than just sampling it. What I'll be doing is I'll be loading just these samples that actually have vocal content.
She blinded me with science.
And these are going to be one-shot samples that will be assigned to individual keys. I will multiple select these samples, and I'll forgo this. I'll actually just program that as part of my sound. I select the first one, multiple select 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. That's 6 individual samples. When I load these, when I press load, we're going to go OK. So it's loaded the WAV files and it's converted it into KSF files found in sampling mode. So if I go to sampling mode and have a look, right? That's our multi-sample. If I now go to this sample section, I'll find, after digging through all the previous individual samples that are there, I will find my new ones. And they start from slot 00304. She blinded me. I can organize these on my keyboard any way I want. I can put note assignments, and it makes sense to put your one-shot samples in the order of their appearance in the song, right? So if you're going to play a particular sample first, it makes sense to put it in the lowest key because they're not pitched samples. The easiest way to keep track of the sequence of these samples is to put them in the correct order from the get-go at the sample level. So I'm just going to listen to the song.
Blinded me with science.
Aha! She blinded me with science. So let's see if that's actually the one. So is that the one?
She blinded me with science.
So this is a different sample. So we start with this.
She blinded me with science.
And I'll put it in this key. I've selected that, and that's from C2 to C2, and that's the range of the sample. And I'm gonna create that. So create. Now let's keep going. Aha. So I think it's this one. Okay. So when I did my sampling session and saved these samples, it looks like it's been saved the other way around, where I have these sounds loaded from front to back, meaning these samples come first and these samples come last. So I'm going to load them the other way around. I'm going to start off with these samples first. So I've already loaded Blinded Me with Science, this one. This is the female sample. Okay. If I want the pitch to be consistent no matter what key I play, I can go to this tab, multi-sample tab. All the samples that are going to be played here will be in a constant pitch, meaning no matter where I put the sample will play in a constant pitch. All right. So this is the second one. Right. And then I'm going to create that index, right? And that's going to be in the C sharp. Create that. And I'm going to go to the third sample, which is actually selected from the bottom of my list. And it's this. And you can see that these samples come as a stereo pair. And I'll be selecting the left sample, and it automatically takes in the right sample with it. Okay, so this one is going to be the next sample, and it's going to be located on the D. And okay, you can see it's D2.
Science!
And I'm going to create that, and then I'm going to locate the samples again. So remember, when we loaded the samples, they occupied the next available slots, which is the latter part of this list. And this one is next. I think it's Science 2.
Science!
So
She blinded me with science!
I have that. I have that one.
Science! Science!
Right. And then create. And the next one after Science 2 is going to be Good Heavens. All right, Good Heavens, Miss Sakamoto.
Good heavens, Miss Sakamoto, you're beautiful.
All right, and then we go create again, and I'm going to choose the next one after that. And the last one is this one. She blinded me. Right? And it's in F2.
She blinded me with science.
So I'm going to press constant pitch to prevent this from going up in pitch if I play more keys. So for instance, if I have this She blinded me, if I don't have this constant pitch selected,
she blinded me. She blinded me.
She blinded me. She blinded me. She blinded me.
that's going to happen. But if I put it at constant pitch,
she blinded me. She blinded me.
no matter where I play it, it's going to stay in one place. Now that I've got all my samples loaded, I'm going to create a program based on these samples. I can go here, drop down. I'm going to convert multi-sample to program. So this is why it's important that you rename your multi-sample from the get-go. Otherwise, you'll create a program that's called new MS something. I'm going to convert this into a playable program, and I'm going to make sure that this program is saved in an empty location. Convert multi-sample to program. Let's do that. I want to put this right after the other programs that make use of these custom samples. So I saved it into user AA, and I'm going to put it there, right? And I'm going to use destination program parameters, and it's going to be saved in AA12. Now, when we do convert MS to program, the advantage of this is whether you load samples in sampling mode or if you load the user bank KSC, your samples will reference correctly to your programs. I've created that. If I go to program mode and go to AA12, which is where I put it, I now have an init program, and it says She blinded me TD. So that's the multi-sample that we used, and it's now a playable sound.
She blinded me. Good help. She blinded me.
And later on, I can edit this and add more effects if I want to put in some reverb or whatever, but the sample map is there. And this is the program that refers to that sample map. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to rename this. I don't want to call this init program. I'm going to write program and call this She blinded me map, right? And there you go. And I'm going to change my category to user 17, which I renamed as NARF Sounds. It's a good idea to put in the category of your program so they're easy to find later on. All my custom sounds, I save that as under category 17 or as NARF Sounds. So I'm going to save that. I can even change this later on. Instead of displaying the actual sample data, I can press this and I can choose play page MSWS drum kit display to say this one. You know, it'll display the picture instead, or in maybe a mixed choir. All right, so I've got that, but I'll do that later on. So I'm gonna record right to update this program. All right, so that's done. But the most important part of this whole exercise is to actually save the sampling data. Right now, if I turn off my Kronos, all these samples that I added into my sampling mode will disappear, because sampling mode is just temporary memory. It's RAM, right? I have to go to disk mode, and I have to locate my original KSC, which is the Booster V3 KSC. In my auto load page, the Booster V3 user bank KSC is already set up, but I'm going to update this. So what I'm going to do is go to the Save tab, press Save, and save sampling data. So what's essentially happening is I'm updating my Booster V3 KSC file, and I want to make sure I'm only saving what's loaded in sampling mode and not whatever else is on the Kronos. If you choose links to EXS, if you have expansion libraries, those links will also be preserved, and it will not work if you load this to a Kronos without those EXS files. Sampling mode data is all we need. We're gonna go OK, and it's all right, and we go OK, And are you sure? Yes. And this is it. So you can see that my user bank and my KSC will update in the size as well. So that's going to change size from its earlier version. You can see that it's increased in size because it now contains more samples than it did previously. All right, so that's done. Currently, I have a program, She Blinded Me with Map. And if you have a look at it, this program is referencing to sampling mode. You can see it says sampling. So what we're going to do, once we do the auto load process, our sampling mode will be cleared and it will be replaced by the user bank KSC, which will reference back into the hard drive. So if I go to global auto load, I already have my booster pack version 3 user bank in here, right? There it is, user bank KSC. Since now I've updated the file, that will reference back and do the update automatically. So all I have to do is do autoload now. Do autoload now, and you get this scary message that it will erase all your sampling data. All that means it's gonna erase the sampling data that's currently loaded in your sampling mode. So whenever you see this message, don't be afraid. That's just gonna clean up sampling mode. It's not gonna delete your samples or anything like that. So you just go okay. And now, well, as soon as this loads, I will have a new program called Blinded Me with Science with the proper samples attached to it. And those samples will not reference to sampling mode, but will reference to my hard drive, therefore saving me precious RAM. By the way, make sure that you save your sampling data in the hard drive, not in the USB stick that you use to acquire your samples. It's been discussed exhaustively that your Khronos cannot read samples from a USB stick. It has to be in the hard drive when you're playing your programs. So if I go back to program mode,
She blinded me with science.
there it is. And if I look at the program itself, because this has been set up in the auto load as the user bank KSC, there it is. You can see that the multi-sample references to the booster v3 file and not sampling data. And that's how you update an existing KSC file. So I hope you enjoyed that. If that was worth something to you, please like and subscribe to my channel, narfsounds.com. If you want to have private lessons, I do that. I have an option on my website for online lessons. Just select the type of lesson you want, whether it's the Khronos or the Montage or the Nautilus. Select that. Choose a time slot in the calendar, and we'll see each other during the lesson. All right, so thank you and goodbye.